Hello everyone, in today's video we are going to discuss how to play the Caro-Kann defense with the black pieces, and in particular we are going to discuss a very crucial variation under the Caro-Kann defense in detail. So every Caro-Kann player or whomever who wants to play the Caro-Kann defense in the future with the black pieces, it's going to be a very essential video for all of them. So I don't want to waste any further time, so let's quickly jump into the video. So we are playing with the black pieces and our opponent with the white pieces starts the game with 1e4. We play c6, this opening is also known as the Caro-Kann defense, g4 the main move, d5, and here white plays the move e5. Indeed, there are many ways for white to continue the position. There is this e5 the advanced Caro-Kann, e into d5, knight to c3, knight to d2, and many more. But in today's video we are going to focus on the move e5, and here there are two main moves to continue the position. One is bishop to f5 and second is c5. So here in my previous videos I have always recommended you guys to play the move c5. So this time as well I'm recommending you guys to play the move c5. And after c5 there are again many ways for white to continue the position, but the main move is to simply capture the pawn. And after pawn takes, we play the move e6. So after e6, here our idea is pretty simple. We want to capture the pawn back on c5. So now there are tons of moves for white in this position to continue the position, like around 7 to 8 moves. But in today's video, we are going to discuss a very interesting and the best move for white in this position, which is a3. This is so-called the best move with the white pieces. After e3, what's the idea? After e3, we are going to simply capture the pawn on c5. And after bishop into c5, white is having two main moves to continue the position. One is to play the move b4, hitting this bishop, and second is to develop the queen to g4, which looks very practical. You are hitting the pawn on g7. So here, let's first try to discuss what happens after b4. After b4, white is simply attacking the bishop on c5. So here, what are you going to continue in this position? If you're playing with the black pieces, you can try to pause the video and try to think how will you play this position. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that many of you guys would have hoped for bishop b6, but bishop b6 is a fine move but not the best. In this position, the best move for black is to play the move bishop to e7. And now what's the idea? We are going to see. After bishop e7, here white plays the move queen to g4, which looks pretty practical. You are hitting the pawn on g7. So here black is kind of forced to push the pawn to g6 because king f8 doesn't make any sense. You are breaking your own castle. So g6, and after g6, now the real fun begin. After g6, white continues with knight f3, and after knight f3, now we are going to play the move a5. And now the importance of bishop on e7 is very much, because after bishop, now the bishop is on e7, it is putting the pressure on the pawn on b4, and our idea is pretty simple. We want to take on b4, takes, and we want to capture the rook. So the only move for white is to push the pawn to b5, because if white tries to play a move like bishop to b2, it's already a bad move after pawn takes, followed by rook takes, bishop takes, and knight to c6, or black can even play the move queen b6, putting more pressure on the pawn on b4. So it's already bad approach from the white side. So white is forced to push the pawn to b5. But after b5, here now the c5 square is extremely weak. So we are going to put our knight to d7 followed by c5, bishop to d3, and now we can already advance via h5, hitting the queen. And now you just need to remember this particular structure. We are going to develop our knight to h6. The idea of a knight to h6 could be to play the move knight to f5. So after knight h6, short castle, b6, bishop b2, knight to c5. And here finishing our development via bishop b7. And here the idea is pretty simple. We can play the move knight f5. If white takes, we can happily take with the g pawn. And our idea is pretty simple. We want to play queen c7 and do a long castle. And as the queen side is extremely blocked, the position is never going to be opened up on the queen side, and you are the one having the open g file and full control of the game, and you are having a high chances of winning this particular position. So this is what happens if your opponent plays the move b4 in this position. So now finally let's try to discuss what happens if white goes for the main move, which is to play the move queen to g4. After queen g4, white's idea is to simply capture the pawn on g7. And in this particular position, we are actually going to play in the spirit of French defense. So after queen g4, we are going to play the move knight to e7. After knight to e7, we are basically provoking white to capture the pawn on g7. So here, white is having three main moves to continue the position. First is obviously to capture the pawn on g7 with the queen. Second is to simply focus on developing the knight via knight to f3. And third and final move, which is to play the move b4, trying to attack the bishop. First, let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays the move queen into g7, simply capturing the pawn. After queen into g7, we are going to play rook g8, queen into pawn, and now queen to b6. What's the idea? After queen b6, first our idea is to simply hit the pawn on f2. And now, second, the bishop can't move from the c1 square because the b2 is hanging. So here, white is having two ways to defend the f2 pawn, which is knight h3 or queen to h4. First, if white tries to play the move knight to h3, after knight h3, we can already continue with knight to c6. And black is having a very interesting position. Black's idea is generally to play bishop d7, capture the pawn on e5 and doing a long castle, and black is way better in the position than you can think. After knight c6, for example, if white plays the move f4, trying to defend the pawn on e5, bishop d7, simply focus on your development, knight c3, and simply long castle. Nothing is happening in this position. White can't play the move knight a4, trying to hit both the pieces because of queen to a5 check, and after knight to c3, you're already having g4, and the piece is trapped. Black is winning the game. So this is what happens if your opponent plays the move knight f4. If opponent captures the pawn on c7, f7, it's already losing for white because after knight g4, the pawn is hanging. So if after bishop d3, trying to defend the pawn, now rook into g2, black is completely winning in this position. So this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move knight to h3. So now let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays the move queen to h4 in order to defend the pawn on f2. After queen to h4, we are going to play the move knight to c6. And our idea is pretty clear. We want to capture the pawn on e5. So knight f3 is already a bad idea to protect the pawn because after moves like knight to f5, hitting the queen, you have to move the queen, and now we can simply capture the pawn on f2. And I know you guys already know that this position is better for black. So it's not a good idea. So the main move after knight c6 is to play the move knight to c3, but simply knight g6, attacking the queen and capturing the pawn on e5, followed by bishop d7, long castle. Black is way better. So this is how you can continue this position if your opponent plays the move queen to h4. So going back a bit, now let's try to discuss what happens if at the place of queen into g7, white go for the move knight to f3, which is the main move. After knight f3, we are going to play the move short castle. Our idea is pretty simple. We are simply short castling. We are simply challenging white to attack on our king side. So after short castle, the main move is to play the move bishop d3, which is also a very natural move. Bishop d3, and at the first glance, it looks like white is having a very heavy attack on the king side. So it should be better for white, at least from the practical side of the view. But after bishop d3, we can already play the move f5. So our idea is pretty simple. We are trying to block this position, trying to restrict the bishop on d3. So here white is again having two main moves, queen g3 or en passant. Definitely en passant is going to be our first choice, which is the obvious move. After ef6, we are going to capture with the rook, queen to h5. What's the idea? Simply h7 is hanging. So already this position still looks extremely bad for black, but now h6. And after h6, it looks like white squares are extremely weak. Again, this position should not be good, but this position is extremely fine for black because every square is covered. Every critical square is covered by the black pawns, and nothing is happening. After h6, short castle, we are going to play the move bishop d6. Now, what is the idea of bishop d6? After bishop d6, we are playing this move because white's idea is already to play the move b4, bishop b2. So playing the bishop d6 in advance is already a move that can benefit you. After bishop d6, here white is again having two main moves, which is c4, trying to open up the position, or playing the move b4, trying to play with bishop b2 idea. First, let's try to discuss what happens after c4. After c4, you can already just focus on your development. Try to develop your pieces because nothing is happening. Because if white tries to capture the pawn, you can capture the pawn back, and nothing is happening. So just keep focusing on developing your pieces. How? Knight to c6. Knight c3. Develop your bishop to d7. Bishop e3. Put your bishop to e8. Queen goes back, and here you can play bishop to g6 maybe, but here it's recommended for you to play the move bishop d7. Again, the threat is to play the move e5. So rook g1, and here if you try to push this pawn, it's not a good move after queen h4, because how can you continue the possession? If you try to play the move pawn push, it's already a bad move after knight e4. So don't try to play this. Don't try to make this work. But after rook d1, just keep developing your pieces. Try to get this piece in your game. So play the move queen e8, and after rook e1, rook d8. And this particular position is very complex, and anything can happen in this position. Any side of the player can go wrong. Basically, black is hoping white to capture the pawn, whereas white is hoping black to capture the pawn. So a very interesting position indeed. So this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move c4. So going back, let's try to discuss after b4. After b4, we are going to play the move knight to g7. What's the idea? Why we developed the knight to g7 at the place of knight to c6? Here, if you try to play knight c6, white is having this opportunity to push the pawn to b5, hit this knight. That's the reason we play the move knight to d7. After knight d7, bishop b2, and here black is having a very strong move, which is to push this pawn to e5. Because after knight takes, bishop takes. And it looks like black will capture the bishop, queen takes, and here white is a pawn up and a better position. But here we are having a better move, which is g6, attacking the queen. The queen cannot capture the pawn because the bishop is hanging. So the fourth move for white is to go back with the queen, but this time rook to e6. The bishop is pinned up. So after f4, knight c6. And here the idea is to simply capture the bishop on e5, and black is having a better position. Black is very comfortable because black would be having the bishop pair, and it looks like the king is extremely weak, but nothing is happening. Everything is well defended. Your idea is to simply capture the bishop on the next move with the knight, and black is having a better position. So this is how you must play if your opponent plays the move b4. So let's go back and try to discuss if at the place of capturing the pawn, white goes back with queen to g3. After queen g3, we are simply going to play the move knight to g6. Now it looks like, why can't we simply focus on our development via knight c6? The basic idea, if you play the move knight c6, white can simply short castle, and here followed by b4, bishop b2, and here white is better because the knight on c6 is not well placed, because white can always kick this knight via b5. So it's always a good idea to first play the move knight to g6, short castle, and now knight to d7. And now it's hard for white to hold on to this pawn. For example, b4, bishop to e7, and white plays bishop to b2. After bishop b2, we are going to play the move a5, trying to punish this overextended pawn structure from the white side. And after b5, we can already play knight c5. The idea could be to play the move knight to e4, cementing the knight on e4. Black is having a very present position. Even queen c7, putting more pressure on this pawn, and black is having a better position. So this is how you must play if your opponent plays the move bishop b2. If your opponent plays something else like knight to c3, you can already push the pawn to g4, because white cannot capture the pawn because the e5 pawn is hanging. So white is forced to move this knight, and now you can play the move knight into pawn, knight into knight, and now bishop to h4, simply attacking the queen. The queen move, capture the knight, and you can already sense who is better in this position. Black is having more space in the center, more pieces are developed. Black is better in this position. So this is how you must play if your opponent plays the move queen to g3. Now going back, now coming to this position, here we have discussed the move knight to f3 and queen into g7. So coming to the last part, what happens if your opponent plays the move b4? After b4, now it looks like we should try to move the bishop now. But in this position, we have a very interesting move, which is h5, attacking the queen. And here black is basically provoking white to capture the pawn on g7. After queen into g7, which is kind of the fourth move, rook g8, hitting the queen, and now simply bishop d4, attacking the rook and getting a pawn. After c3, it looks like black is kind of forced to move back, but here simply knight d7. Simply double attacking the queen and the pawn. You can win the pawn, and after a move like maybe queen h4, bishop into e5, black is better in this position. c3 is weak, you can play a5, queen to c7. Black is very comfortable in this position. So this is how you must play this Caro-Kann defense against this a3 variation. Very interesting one. So yeah, I hope that this video might have helped you to increase your knowledge. If it did, then make sure to like this video and make sure to share this video with everyone, whoever is trying to play the Caro-Kann defense, or particularly this c5. It's basically a better version of French defense. I must highly recommend you to play this particular opening. So yeah, that's it for today. Make sure to subscribe to our channel if you're new to our channel, because it's free for you, but it helps us to motivate to make videos like this. You can tell me in the comment box below which video should I make next, and I'm going to come up with that particular video on. So I'm going to see you soon. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching OneShot Chess.